dyslexia actually comes with a unique set of strengths. And learning that for me was another step on my journey of saying, oh my goodness, like not only are my kids smart, not only will they eventually learn to read, but they are also very uniquely gifted. And so it's just been this wild ride of like, oh, what appeared to be something bad and needing to be fixed is actually turned out in the end to be a blessing.
Welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast, where our goal is to help you thrive in your homeschool journey. Today, I am welcoming Marianne Sunderland to the podcast. Marianne has homeschooled for 20 plus years, and 7 of her 8 children are dyslexic. During her journey to teach her kids in a way that they can learn and nurture their God-given gifts, she has authored 3 books, hosted a podcast, and speaks around the country. Before we jump in, don't forget to hit subscribe and share this podcast with your friends, family, or anyone who could use a little encouragement today. And if you're watching on YouTube or listening on your favorite app, leaving a like, comment, or review really helps more families find the show. So stay tuned. I think you're really going to be encouraged. This podcast is brought to you by BJU Press Homeschool. Homeschooling is an exciting adventure we take with our children. One of the most challenging parts of this journey is choosing the curriculum you want to use. BJU Press Homeschool is a curriculum you can trust. All the books, resources, and videos have been designed with you and your child in mind. Their curriculum is educationally robust and rich, taking into account that children have different learning styles, strengths, and needs. Mom, you are in charge. BJU Press Homeschool is here to come alongside and support you. Do you need help with the teaching load, or is there a subject you just don't want to teach? Their amazing video courses are available for all grades and almost every subject. BJU Press Homeschool believes that homeschooling can produce a new generation of students who know God, love their neighbors, and stand firm in their faith. For more information, go to bjupresshomeschool.com. That's bjupresshomeschool.com. Marianne, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Zan. I'm super excited to chat with you.
Well, it was so good for those of you who wouldn't know this, which is most of you. We had a special needs summit last week at BJU Press and had about 25 leaders in the special needs community, special needs homeschooling community. And Marianne was there, and it gave us a chance to reconnect. We've been in several places together over the years of our homeschooling, but last week was a really special time just to see you and reunite with you again.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a really special time. Very encouraging.
So I want to start by reading a quote from your book, No More School. And let me just read the full title, and then I'll come back and read the quote. No More School, Meeting the Educational Needs of Kids with Dyslexia and Language-Based Learning Difficulties. And so I want to say this about your book before we get into our conversation. I found it helpful for all kids everywhere, not just kids with special learning needs, because I think there's some universal principles there that you hit on that encourage all parents.
Yeah.
So having said that, let me read this quote that I love. I'm going to take you along on my journey of breaking down the status quo of ideas of what it means to be intelligent and educated. Then you will be left with the freedom to rebuild the kind of education you provide for your children into one that truly meets their individual needs. So we want to hear about this journey today. Marianne, tell us how you got started in homeschooling.
It's kind of funny, actually. When I was first married, my husband is Australian and British. And so we knew early on that we wanted to travel. And we were living in LA. So the school situation wasn't ideal, that's Los Angeles, where it was
You're right.
just like,
Not Lower Alabama.
yeah,
Okay.
not Louisiana. And so anyway, when our 2 youngest kids were 4 and 2, we went to Australia because we were thinking of maybe moving there. And while we were there, we met up with his pastor from when he was living there, and they gave me Raymond Moore's books. They had homeschooled their kids, and they gave me, like, Better Late Than Early and so I've
And Homegrown Kids, I saw
Homegrown
that. That was the
Kids.
book that was my gateway in.
I'm telling you, and the lady they were such wonderful people, and so, we'd been talking about maybe homeschooling, and then I read these books, and it really resonated with me, and then, so we started homeschooling, and it was kind of a rough road, like,
Was this the '90s that you were homeschooling?
yes, it was 1996, I think, when we
Okay.
started, 95, 96, and, like, the first year, I went to the drugstore and got workbooks, like a math book. I had no idea what I was doing, and then I went to, CHEA, the California Home Educators Association or Christian Home Educators Association here in
Of
California.
California,
Went
that's
to a
right.
conference, went to the curriculum hall, and came home with rod and staff 1st grade. Like it was so heavy, I think I needed, like, a wagon to bring it to my car. It was a textbook and a workbook, and I got the extra seat works, workbooks, 'cause that resonated with me. I loved that about school. Anyway, so you're asking how we got started homeschooling. We wanted to travel with our kids, which we did a lot, um, and then as time went on, and we realized that our kids were dyslexic, when we were traveling for a few years, we rented our house out to a family from our church, and they put their kids in the public school where our kids would have gone. Turns out that their daughter was dyslexic, the school handled it really poorly, and so when we got back, my oldest was about 12, and he still wasn't really reading fluently, and I was getting a lot of pressure, to maybe put him in school where the educational experts are, which is not true. But that story kept me from putting him in school because my husband said he had had a terrible time in England, growing up in England, with dyslexia. He said, I am not putting my kids through that. We will figure it out.
So let me, back up just a little bit and ask you, when did you suspect that your son, and then your second one too, were dyslexic?
Well, at about 6, I noticed that the rules weren't sticking, in his he could master
The rules of reading, you
the
mean?
rules of reading,
Yeah, okay.
yeah, so he just couldn't remember them, and he was so bright, I could tell. I mean, had a huge vocabulary, very insightful, and so about 7 in 2nd grade, we ended up getting him tested by a local, psychoeducational tester, and that's when we found out he was dyslexic. And coincidentally, and this often happens to families, found out that his dad was dyslexic also. He was like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know there was a name for this thing."
Okay, so your husband was and didn't know it until
Right.
you had the diagnosis for your first son.
You're right, yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, so I could just tell, and most parents have a sense, they'll see a kid who is very eloquent and very intelligent and insightful, and then when they sit down to read, it's like it doesn't make sense, it's like there's gotta be something going on. Yeah.
So, all right, so when you realized that he was having okay, I'm gonna read you I love your book, by the way, so I'm gonna keep quoting yourself to you because I think our listeners will really enjoy this. Um, the journey of understanding dyslexia and other language-based learning disabilities figures prominently into your homeschool story. As I read your book, now this is not the quote. Okay, sorry, this is me. I was really encouraged by your perseverance, especially in the light of having learning about this journey. And so you tell the story about him. What was your oldest son's name? Was that Zach?
Zach. Mhm.
About Zach not learning to read, and that figured a little bit into your sailing adventure. And I remember you talking about in your book how you really learned the importance of hands-on learning by
Mhm.
that adventure with him, and that was to me, it looked like that was the genesis of your definition of education expanding and morphing.
Yes, yeah, it's a journey, my story is really a journey of learning, Uh, so interesting because so when he was 9, we rented our house out and we went sailing for 3 years. 9 years old is usually when kids are really learning to read, but, um and there were no schools, there was no tutoring, um, and during that time, I was concerned, because I grew up in a home full of traditional learners. I mean, my grandmother, who was born in 1906, had a master's degree. Like, we were into education, right? And so
Right, that's very unusual, yep.
and a lot of families is not uncommon to feel very worried when your child can't read because that's really it's that opens the whole world to a person to be able to read books, which I loved as a kid. So, we're down in Mexico and, uh, you know, God was very good to me and showed me through the story actually of Moses and Aaron, how when Moses went to God and said, "I can't talk to Pharaoh, because I'm not good with speech." Well, before we had gone on our trip, we were looking at maybe doing vision therapy, which has been shown not to help with dyslexia, but it was a thing at the time. And, and so I had really wanted to do this vision therapy, but it just wasn't gonna work out, and so what does God say to Moses? Who made your eyes and who made your mouth?" And it's funny how God's word can just kinda speak to you in these situations in an unusual way, but for me at that time, it was another sign, another little step on my journey that God was saying, "I made him, and I had a sense that it was gonna be okay." And then we got back from our trip, and he was about 12, and he did start to read. He started to read, and he was reading, like, classics, the great illustrated classics, and I remember my dad just remarking, like, "I can't believe this, like, you got a 12-year-old reading Mark Twain," you know?
You're right, right,
And
right.
and that was another sign to me that despite the fact that for the first 6 years of his education, he was playing, like,
And
reading
sailing,
stories.
seeing the
Yeah,
world.
yeah, I mean, we were reading Robinson Crusoe, and we were anchored at a little bay in Mexico, and he and a bunch of the kids who were also sailing were hacking down. He bartered to buy a machete on the beach from a guy, uh, you know, chopping down bamboo and making a fort and chopping up coconuts to make bowls like Robinson Crusoe, and this was kind of like and in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, "This can't be enough. This can't be enough. How are we ever gonna catch up?" But I didn't really have much of an option at the time, so
Right.
I just figured we're gonna just figure it out, and we did, and so, again, just my story kept unfolding through my older kids, how playing a lot when you're little is actually a good thing, reading and experiencing life, is a good education. It's enough.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, it's interesting because here's the quote I was looking for because I think we all get caught up in this. And I too had a son. It's not that it was easy for me, but I studied and did very well, like you talked about doing. And so this quote for me was particularly poignant. It says, teaching smart but struggling students can be confusing and worrying and consequently overwhelming. You see, in 1998, when my oldest son was diagnosed with dyslexia at 7, I had no idea that there were smart people that struggled to learn to read. Learning differences and different ways of being smart had quite literally never come up on my radar until I started homeschooling my kids. And, that's one thing we talked about a lot last week is just the way we measure intelligence. I remember talking to an MD, a medical doctor in an ER room, an emergency room, and he was ADHD, and he said, it's my ADHD that allows me to come into this room and look at 10 different injured people and know what to do with all 10. Most people, that's just too much sensory overload. For me, it's how my mind works. And he said something to me then. He said, if the dyslexic and the ADHD people of the world could write the standardized test, the ones who do poorly would be the ones who can sit in their notes, sit in their desk, take notes, and read all day long. And so, and that really stuck with me. But there are so many different ways to measure intelligence, and you take us from that fear of learning differently to the blessing of learning differently in many ways.
Yeah, I look back now having homeschooled I'm in my 30th year. I'm homeschooling my last one. And I look back and I think, at the time, like when your kids are young with dyslexia, it's rough, especially if you have multiple children because they're not independent. And so you have to help them with everything. But when um when I look back at my life of educating my kids, I recognize now that it actually was a blessing because instead of giving my kids a cookie cutter, a mile wide and an inch deep education, I've been able to give them a truly individualized, unique education, one that helps them to be critical thinkers, that helps them to be curious, to be like what we call lifelong learners. And those characteristics are what propel us as young adults and as adults to be successful. You know what I mean? To have curiosity, to have interest, to have confidence to go and do the things that are interesting to us because fast forward, when I look at my adult kids, I recognize now that the things that they were good at and the things that they enjoyed is where they ended up. That's how God made us. He made us the things that he's called us to do. We like doing largely. I mean, sometimes it's hard, right? Homeschooling is hard, but anyway, it's all you know, God's education plan, if you will, and in the book, I talk about the foundations of our current school system and how, why it was set up the way that it was, but how it really isn't the only way to teach. It's certainly not teaching the way that people naturally learn. So it's okay. I try to walk parents through like it's okay to discard some of these things. Um, to choose what fits best for your child so that they can be curious and confident and critical thinkers and move into the world even if they don't do a lot of high level learning in high school. They can be very successful in the world and in college as adults.
There's this book by Malcolm Gladwell called David and Goliath. I don't know
Yeah.
if you've read that one or not,
Mm-mm.
but there's a chapter in there about kids with dyslexia. And he talks about this very brilliant lawyer who said because of his problem with reading, learned to memorize large chunks of information. And so as they're going through trials, he's memorizing things that people are saying and briefs he's read. And he could always bring together in the courtroom little details and nuances that nobody else could because he was dyslexic. And I thought that was pretty amazing.
Traditionally, dyslexia has been looked at as a deficit, something that needs to be fixed. And I wanna say back in like 2005, I don't know when they wrote it. The Ides, Furnett and Brock Ides wrote a book called The Dyslexic Advantage, and they worked out of Stanford. It's a fascinating study, and they looked at the brain structure of what they called successful dyslexics. So these are people with dyslexia who went on to run businesses, have successful careers, what have you. And so they recognized different brain structures in the dyslexic brain, and then they recognized also these strengths that are somewhat unique to dyslexic people. And even more interesting to me is that the very weaknesses, say, that a dyslexic person has, so in details, math facts, spelling, they're always a struggle for people with dyslexia. But the opposite of that is that they have these very strong, big picture strengths. So, seeing connections other people don't see, seeing solutions to things that other people don't see. And so they have this unique ability to there's a lot of entrepreneurs and engineers to create something new out of a situation that is in need, but other people don't see it, say. So dyslexia actually comes with a unique set of strengths, and learning that for me was another step on my journey of saying, "Oh my goodness, like, not only are my kids smart, not only will they eventually learn to read, but they are also very uniquely gifted." And so it's just been this wild ride of like, oh, what appeared to be something bad and needing to be fixed is actually turned out in the end to be a blessing.
You're so I keep reading to you from your own book, but Marianne, I loved your book. I want to read one more thing for you because I think this is where 99% of homeschool moms are, whether their kids are gifted, be considered gifted in learning or have different learning styles or different learning needs. There was always an underlying fear and worry that my kids would never catch up and therefore never be successful. I was frequently worried that I was doing our kids a disservice by homeschooling them. And, I've talked to so many moms who seem to have ideal circumstances who still say, my biggest fear is that I'm going to ruin my kids instead of bless them. And I think that's just a result of doing education differently. Anytime you do something different like homeschooling, you wonder, is this experiment going to work or not?
Yes. And I think there's a couple of factors that helped me to overcome that, and now my goal is to be a light for other parents to follow. And that one is that if God has called you to homeschool, then you don't need to worry about it, right? You lift that homeschool up to him and you know that it's going to be okay. Second was being in aligned with my husband, that we both agreed that it was necessary to do, and we were both on board with that. Now, I know not all families have that, but for us, that was another, like, okay, I don't know how this is all gonna work out, but God's okay and my husband's okay, like, and we're all in it together kinda thing.
Yeah, a
But
walk by faith, really. Yeah.
yes, yes, and then, of course, as I've mentioned, these spots along the journey where I recognized, um, you know, that my kids were gonna be okay, one by one, they were graduating and starting businesses and, graduating with honors from college, and I'm like, "What is going on?" And so I think that's why people who've been homeschooling for a while really need to get their stories out there because it is I remember distinctly being just sick with worry about my kids, thinking, one by one, they'd come out dyslexic, and I'd think, "Oh, no."
Oh, oh, we do need to mention the minor detail that 7 of your 8 children are dyslexic,
Mhm. Yeah,
and
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 the
so
first
that's
2
no
were
small
mild.
thing. Yeah.
It's not. It was I used to worry. I would think, "Oh my gosh, all my kids do is play." They're just constantly playing, and I was pregnant, so I'd be reading aloud, and I'd fall asleep on the couch, and I'd wake up, and they're all outside playing, and I'm thinking, "Oh my gosh, I'm such a failure." But my kids come to me now, and my older kids, and they'll say, "We're so lucky to be homeschooled because we got to have a childhood, we got to play and imagine and be relaxed, they could grow up slowly and just be safe." So, um, you know, it's yeah, it doesn't look like traditional education, and I think that's what trips parents up sometimes, because even if you're in classes or using traditional curriculum, there's still days where there's the toilet overflows or you're all sick and you're not getting school done. And even little things like that can knock a parent's confidence and say, we're not getting enough done. We haven't done 5 days, 6 hours a day of school or whatever it might be that is your standard. And you just have to keep laying it down before the Lord, pivoting, looking at the big picture. What's really important for my kid to learn from this? So it takes a lot of courage, I think, to continue homeschooling and to believe. But I'm here to say that it works. It definitely works. It equips our kids to live productive lives as adults, among many other benefits.
Right. My oldest son, Ty, is the reason we talked about this a little bit at the summit on special needs. Way we got into homeschooling is that he was just delayed a year or two in learning to read. We didn't know what that learning difference would look like. But, over the years, we did the same thing. We did a lot of reading out loud together. We took a lot of breaks. We did a lot of delight directed learning, and I just want to say this to those that are listening. We used a lot of traditional curriculum like BJU Press Homeschool. It was called BJU Press then, but we modified it to fit the needs of each of our children, which you can do at home. And so I think that's one of the things that makes homeschooling so powerful. And when I had Ty tested, I know you've experienced this before he went to college, because I just needed to know, like you said in your book, that I hadn't ruined him, that all the things we did differently had built him up and made him a better student. I love what you say in your book, because this is exactly what he was a pediatrician turned educational psychologist and diagnostician. He said, I realized later that I was intuitively using accommodations and modifications, something that nowadays I highly recommend when teaching kids who learn differently. And so, that's exactly what Dr. Sussman said to me, saying, you have naturally made accommodations for Ty that I knocked my head against the wall asking classroom teachers to make. And so it just I felt like as I was reading your book, I was reliving my journey a little bit, Marianne. I felt that way last week when we got together, but I think it's so significant because so many moms feel that way.
In one of my mentoring groups last week, we were talking about why homeschooling is so successful, what it came down to is we recognize is the parents' love for their children, that we love our kids and we see their value, and we start from there, and we're like, okay, so they're smart and they're struggling, and so we're doing history. How can he learn history without reading it and writing it? And you just do whatever, an audiobook, mom reads, discussion instead of worksheets, and you
You
see your
visit
kid
the historical
thriving.
sites. Yeah,
Yes.
so sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, exactly, and so you start with the premise that your child is smart and desires to do well. Like, our kids don't they're not doing this to be difficult, especially the ADHD child. They're not trying to be difficult, they're struggling. And so how can we get that information in? It becomes kind of a fun challenge, like how can I um, help him to learn or her in a way that meets their needs? And I've modified through high school and sometimes very outside the box, for different kids' needs. And it's a joy. It's a joy to learn together and see somebody who really struggles in certain areas find success, because I'll tell you what, those accommodations, people think, "Oh, well, that's cheating and they shouldn't do that." It helps our kids learn at their intellectual ability, number 1, and number 2, it makes them feel successful, and that feeling of success builds. So, if your kid can use a calculator for long division, right, or use a mastery-based math program so that they're actually not their ADHD brain's not overwhelmed by spiral-based, they they feel smart and successful, and they come to the table the next day like, "I can do this." I'm telling you, that's half the battle sometimes.
Yes, that really is true. I remember James Dobson saying years and years ago on Focus on the Family that every child needs to have something they excel in, and for him, it was
Yes.
tennis. And
Okay.
that's where he got a lot of his determination to keep going in life, was because
Mhm.
he had that one area where he really excelled. We also know he's a very bright man, but you don't know where that began developing. I just
Mhm.
remember him
Mhm.
talking about how important the tennis was for him.
Yeah.
There's one more quote I wanna read to you because I think it's so key. Our son was smart, and there was a reason that he was struggling that wasn't due to parental failure or a lack of intelligence. And to me, that is so key because as a parent, when you have a child who learns differently, I mean, the whole first year I homeschooled, I kept thinking, this is my fault. This is my fault. If I had a different curriculum, if I was a better parent, if I understood teaching better, Ty would be totally different. But that's not it's not parental failure and it's not a lack of intelligence, but you've got to crack the code for each child.
Yeah, and that is one of the I mean, it is probably besides leading our kids to the Lord, is probably the best part of homeschooling is being able to give our kids what they need. If they're not feeling well, we take a day off. If everyone's trying to kill each other, we just go to the beach for the day. And nobody dies, like it's like they still learn and it's all good. But I think stepping outside the box of traditional education, even in small amounts, makes people really nervous because we care about our kids and we want the best for them. But um that's why I wrote that book, just because it's so important, I think, for parents to feel comfortable in their God-given right to raise their children, the way that that no one cares for your kids like you, and kids want to do well, like they're not graduating from high school and sitting around playing video games, like, they want to succeed, they want to find their path, and so our job is just to help them.
So I have to ask you this. Sailing has figured prominently in your kids' stories.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that. First, you had that free 3-year journey
Yeah.
when you
Mhm.
sailed. Was that around the world or was that to different ports or what
No.
did you do with that?
We spent a couple summers at the local islands, just getting the boat ready and seeing if we could do it with 4 kids, and then one year we went down to Mexico and sailed all along the coast there, and then we had thought maybe we'd cross over to Hawaii or go down through Panama and go into, the Caribbean and, the Atlantic, but we had one kid who is now a yacht captain, which is ironic, but he was so seasick that friends of ours had crossed the ocean. It takes about 3 weeks to get from California or Mexico to Hawaii, and they said, "Don't do it. It's too hard for the kids," and so we came home, but so we sailed we were living on our boat at the islands in Mexico for 3 years when we had the first 4 kids.
So so now tell us a little bit. Let's fast forward. Tell us, was it your 2 oldest that actually sailed around the world solo?
Yeah. Yeah, so that first kid, that couldn't spell his name, ZAC, in first grade, gosh, it's such an amazing story, but essentially, he was about 16, and he had this idea of sailing around the world, and we'd read, of course, all these books about people who'd sail around the world, and, Robin Lee Graham in the '60s, a young guy that sailed around the world, and so, we were like, "Oh, well, what boat would you use?" And he had an idea, and we said, "Well, what route would you take?" And he had an idea, and so we prayed about it, and everything came together. He had saved money from his dad taught him how to, like, buy and sell little dinghies. He'd fix them up and sell them, and so he bought the boat. We had invested our life savings into making it seaworthy, and he sailed around the world when he was 16. He stopped, I think, maybe 15 times and all around the world, and came back, at 17. He was the youngest person to sail around the world alone. Now he's the youngest American because there are a couple other, kids who've gone around. In fact, ironically, these 2 New Zealander and the British guy that sailed around the world, the young guys, they're both dyslexic also. So,
Really?
yeah,
That
we
is
called it
so interesting.
the Dyslexic Solo Circumnavigators Club. But then, Abby, my daughter, she's 2 years younger than Zach. She had wanted to sail around the world when she was young. I don't know where she got the idea, but we were like, "There's no way." She was like 13 or 14. But after Zach got back and she was 16, she said, "Well, I wanna go now." And I said, "Well, too bad we don't have any money. You can't go." And, she's but then we had worked with a publicist, and he put out, like, a press release, I guess it was, looking for sponsors, and no joke, like, in 3 days, she had full sponsorship, and the rest, she bought the boat, and, yeah, so and that that experience, like, our experience of traveling and sailing a lot, as kids, among other things, was very formative. I highly recommend if families can travel, to travel when their kids are young, because when they're older, they kinda wanna be connected to peers, and, we wanted to try to travel before our parents got old so we could be here for them, but it was, yeah, very formative experience, the whole sailing for our kids.
So, for those people who may not just have the financial ability to do what you did, what are the principles you can extract from your kids' experiences and maybe help parents who can't do that to figure out how to give those same ideals to their children?
Well, I mean, the travel was nice because they met a lot of different people. So, for example, when we were sailing in Mexico, there were a lot of families out there, and interestingly, a lot of them were working class, plumbers, electricians that had invested well. My husband was a shipwright, so he repaired boats. That was his work. And they were just good with money. But one of the things I think that really had a big impact on them was, so when I was 12, I told my dad, "I want a horse," and he was just like, "Too bad you're not getting a horse," But when Abby was 12, she came to us and said, "I want a horse." And before I could say, "There's no way you're getting a horse," Lawrence, her dad, said, "Well, how would you pay for it?" And it turned out that she had been doing 4-H for many years, and this is so funny, taking turkeys to the fair and winning grand champion and reserve grand champion, and they would pay like $1,200 for these turkeys at the auction. It was kind of
That's
fun.
crazy. I heard about that at a homeschool conference. I mean, those awards are crazy.
It's a great program.
Yes,
She's really
amazing.
loved it, but anyway, she said, well, she had saved like $3,000 from these turkeys that she sold, and rabbits. She did rabbits too. And, so he actually inspired them to, well, if you want a horse, how are you gonna get it? What do you recommend? And so and then same with Zach when he came with the idea of sailing around the world, instead of saying, "That's ridiculous, you're 16, you're in school," which is a lot of feedback that we got from other parents. Um, he challenged him, "Well, what boat would you take and what route would you take?" And it was just kind of, it was really their dad that inspired them to dream, and not be limited by what may appear to be, uh, limitations in your finances or your age or what have you. So, I don't know. I think encouraging our kids, if they want to. It's funny how a lot of times they want to do stuff that we have no knowledge of. I've never owned a horse. I mean, we were knowledgeable about sailing, but some of the kids, the stuff they're doing, I'm like, I have no idea. But good luck with that.
Well, that's great. I mean, that really is learning to learn,
Yeah.
being an independent learner and having an education that has application in real life.
Yeah.
One of the other things I loved in your book, maybe it's because I just find this not trivia, this information so inspiring, were all the people in history who have been dyslexic.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
some really
Mhm.
surprised me, like Winston Churchill.
Yeah. And if you think about it, like, he had this very untraditional way of looking at the situation in history at that time, and people didn't like him. They thought that he was crazy, but his ideas worked, and so, um yeah, great leader, and again, it's that ability to troubleshoot and problem solve in nonlinear ways, perhaps, or seeing connections and patterns that other people don't see. But there's a lot of entrepreneurs, Richard Branson, who has the Virgin Atlantic and Virgin Records, like, I think they call it the Virgin Enterprises now or something. Famously left school at 16 and said, "If you can just get through school, you'll be fine," and, really didn't know much. Like, I remember seeing an interview, he didn't understand gross and net profit, and
Which is hard to believe.
somebody told him about a net pulling fish out, and all the extras kind of, some fell out, but what was left was your net, and, uh, and I thought, "Here's this bazillionaire with all these businesses, an empire, if you will, and he doesn't know about gross and net, but he surrounded himself with people who did, which is a strength of dyslexics, to find, and it is an attribute of successful dyslexics to be able to know what help you need and ask for it, and find places or things that can help you.
That is so interesting. One thing you touched on in your book a lot is just this idea of strength-based learning or interest-based learning, and I think that's where homeschooling excels anyway,
Yeah.
is to be able to be a student of your child, see how they're uniquely made, and customize that education. But when you have a child who's dyslexic, I think maybe the pressure to do that you feel as a mom is just increased from the challenges you have.
Well, one of the things about interest-led learning is that it's motivating. And so, for example, I had one of my kids once was really he wanted a fish tank and he wanted to populate it with fish. And so we would go to the library and get all these books on fish, and he was reading them, and he was making notes in a notebook, and I'm looking at him going, "What?" And then we would, of course, go to all the aquarium stores in town and talk to everybody and price everything out, and then, Blake Bowles is an unschooler, who's written a bunch of books. He's a big, unschool fan, and I happened to be doing an interview with him on my podcast shortly afterwards, and I was like, "Oh, well, he's reading and he's writing, and it's English and it's his science, and the chemical compounds in the water." And he was like, "You're missing the whole point." He said, "The point is that he has an interest, he's curious, and he's pursuing it. Like, these are the underlying like, that saying, education is not the filling of the bucket, but the lighting of a fire." That's what comes to mind. This idea that it doesn't really matter if your kids can solve algebraic equations or write a 5-paragraph essay. Yes, if they go to college, they're going to need that, but but they can learn that later. My kids who went to college, their high school experience was very relaxed. And they did have probably more of a learning curve, than other kids getting into college, but they were totally able to do it. But it was that underlying confidence, curiosity, that feeling of like, I can do this with the right support, that really propels dyslexic kids to find their thing and move in it, I think.
I was just thinking about one of my most favorite experience with our boys. Well, a lot of their education happened in the legislature, but so later on, we're studying American history and American literature when they're in high school, and we use the BJU Press text as our source of information. But we're doing those things together, and then we ended up going to Philadelphia and Boston, walking the Freedom Trail, and going to Williamsburg. It was really those were just fun days because you want to make their education come alive. You want them to love that learning, and that's whether they have special needs or they're very traditional learners or, everybody benefits, I think, from education as you've described it for us,
Mhm.
Marianne.
That's
So
true. Yeah.
so thank you so much for the gift of your book and for sharing the lives of your children with
Ah.
us. Tell us the title of your book again, where people can find it, and then how they can find you.
I have 3 books, but this one is my latest, and it's one that's, dear to my heart because it's really sharing so much about encouraging parents to, but it's called No More School, Meeting the Educational Needs of Kids with Dyslexia and Learning Language-Based Learning Difficulties. That's a long one. And my website is homeschoolingwithdyslexia.com.
I really can't recommend Marianne's books and her website enough. And so if you have this child with these special challenges or learning differences, I would highly encourage you to consider it. And if you don't, I think you'll be highly inspired by her book. I read through the book and it resonated with me for all 3 of my children who all learn totally differently. Some very traditionally, others totally outside the box. So Marianne, thank you for all your hard work. Thank you for persevering with your family through the struggles to find the joy. And thank you for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Zan.
And, and as always, you can find me at zantyler.com. Thanks for joining us in the podcast today. I know you have 1,000 different places you could spend your time. So we continue to pray that God will bless you and your children on your homeschool journey. Until next time, bye.